When Worlds Collide, Lecture 1. So what you need to understand about these recorded lectures is that I do move more quickly than I do in class. So you might have to have your finger on the pause button. Roughly 30,000 years ago, the land bridge between North America and Asia opens that scholars have called BERINGIA. Migrations occur in several waves between Siberia and Alaska, populating the Americas, though it's quite possible also that native peoples came to the Americas by boat as well. These migrants spread across the Americas such that by 1491 their population was around 50 million people. And from Alaska down to the tip of South America, they produced the incredible and stunning diversity of native peoples that occupied the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. The diversity of North America created a stunning array of civilizations, Indian peoples across the continents. Some of those peoples, like the Pueblo and the Cherokee, were farming people whose societies were built on the cultivation of corn. In the interior of the United States, corn cultivation reached its apex in the mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley, with sites in Ohio, in Illinois, in Oklahoma. I'll show you a map very soon of the number of mound-building sites. The most famous of the mound-building sites is just outside of what is now St. Louis, and that's called Cahokia, which could have had a population of around 30,000. Probably not that many, but possibly that many before over-farming and floods wiped out the Cahokian peoples. There were mobile hunting societies on the plains, societies like the Comanche, and in upstate New York, the Iroquois, both of which could live from agricultural means, gathering nuts, berries, those sorts of things. The Iroquois even farmed. But hunting was also important to them, tracking buffalo or tracking big game. Many of the Native American cultures both hunted and farmed. So part of the year, hunting provided their protein, their meat, and even their clothing, and sometimes grease and tools. And then the other part of the year, farming provided the rest of their calories. In almost all cases, what a group of people did in North America and South America depended largely on the geography and the resources available to them. So the environment will shape a lot of these early cultures in terms of the economies that they build, in terms of how they get their food supplies. Here's a map showing Beringia and the migration across from Siberia to North America down the frozen coastline. The possibility of water travel has not been ruled out by people sort of leaping down the coast. And this map just illustrates the diversity of North America after native peoples populated. It also illustrates the effect of geography and the environment, such that hunting is the dominant form of gathering food and resources for this middle area here, the plains, and the north here. Agriculture is more common in the east, among the Navajo and the Hopi, who, in spite of the aridity of the desert Southwest, learned to cultivate corn very successfully. Coastal peoples could also fish, hunting and gathering in these red areas. Here is the Anasazi Cliff Palace complex in Mesa Verde, southern Colorado, just illustrating how people of the early Americas adapted to their environment. So these folks built in the sides of protruding cliffs, these very large, what appear to be like urban settlements almost. And then they would grow corn in the flatlands below, carefully irrigating their corn so that they could have a food supply. Here's an illustration of similar cliff dwellings in Cañon de Chelly in modern-day Arizona. And a similar picture from a different angle, just showing how high up these places were, how difficult they would be to get to, and therefore how easy it would be to defend them. Here's a map just showing mound building cultures of North America. So roughly the Mississippi Valley is where you see mound building peoples. In Ohio, it's Adena and Hopewell, and then in the green areas, these are Mississippian tradition mound builders. So all these dots here are mound burial sites through the South and the Midwest. We do have mounds in Ohio. This is the Great Serpent Mound near Chillicothe. It's about 1,200 feet long. It's an Adena Hopewell mound. There are mounds closer in Newark that evidently function as a giant calendrical system. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the largest mounds of them all, Cahokia, between 1200 and 1400, just before the arrival of Europeans. Another illustration showing just the size of Cahokia, built entirely on an economy of corn, but eventually their deforestation along these waterways contributed to their demise as floods increasingly grew more and more devastating. Here's an illustration by a European visitor to the Americas in the 1580s, showing fishing being a way for Native peoples to gather food. This is on the coast of what is today North Carolina. And see, they have their canoe. They've even got a fish trap known as a weir. These are what we would call teepees, built on the plains, stretched over wooden poles made of buffalo hides, and dependent on the resources of the plains, which don't have very many trees, so you're not going to see, lots of sturdy wooden buildings. These are also mobile, so it allows these people to hunt, pack up the resources, and move when they need to find fresh new sources of food. This is a longhouse built by the Iroquois, which would be more common to see in New York and Canada. These would be built of sticks and then mats made of bark, and other materials would be stretched over them. The insides would house several families. There'd be a fire. People would keep warm with bear skins. Here's just another illustration of a longhouse. If you go to South America, which I know it's outside of North America, but it's just an illustration of the diversity and the complexity of early Native American civilizations. If you go to Mesoamerica, Mexico, South America, you see these fantastic civilizations built by the Incas, the Mayas, and the Aztecs. Civilizations with pyramids, with calendars, with alphabets and language and monumental sculpture. This is a 13th century Inca king, for example. So I know we're accustomed to thinking of, Native American societies as not having powerful rulers, but some of them, in fact, did. The Incas were exceptionally good at terraced agriculture in the mountains of South America and the Andes. And so they built large cities on the tops of these mountainous areas and these terraces on which they grew their food. This is a Mayan observatory at Chichen Itza. The Mayans were perhaps some of the most advanced of all early American cultures in their astronomical observations. This is the Temple of the Sun at Teotihuacan. So monumental agriculture, monumental buildings, sorry, not agriculture, but agriculture as well, common in these civilizations. By the 1400s, Europeans are starting to reach outwards to the Americas to learn more about their world as they're looking for water routes to Asia and the riches and the resources to Asia. The people who first do this are the Portuguese. They are excellent map makers and sailors. They are also the initiators of the Atlantic slave trade because they explore the coast of Africa and they start slavery on islands in the Atlantic where they put slaves to work growing sugar. And pretty soon everybody wants to get in on the game that the Portuguese are playing as they're growing this valuable commodity, sugar, as they're sailing to the east, to China and India. And that brings a lot of Europeans in competing for these riches and these resources. The resources could include people, i.e. slaves. It could include the land itself, goods available on the land like sugar, or metals like gold and silver. The Europeans also have a strong desire to spread their religion. The Spanish and the Portuguese are Catholic, as are the French, and they think it is their sacred and solemn duty to spread their faith around the globe. And so religious motivations are important. One early invader of South America put it this way. He said, "We came here to serve God and also get rich." The leading states to take advantage of exploration and colonization around the world, and eventually the discovery of North America, were strong states that put their finances and their state leadership behind the idea of exploring. So Portugal had an investment in shipbuilding and map making and travel. Spain eventually got in on this, followed by France. Weaker states like England, with their own internal problems, do not get involved until later. Advances in shipbuilding and map making help make those early state ventures successful. So you're going to find the Portuguese and the Spanish, eventually the Dutch and the French, sailing all around the world, searching out its riches for the glory and for the power of their home countries. This map just shows the European world at the time that exploration begins. And European nations, Portugal and Spain in particular, are interested in getting all the way around Africa over here to India and to China, to Sumatra, Java, places where there are spices, where there are valuable trade goods, and what they're interested in is getting by these middlemen in the Middle East here, these Ottoman Turks who control access to all these goods. And if they can sail around by water, they can cut out these guys. And that is eventually what happens. Here's a map showing, sorry, not a map, an illustration showing the involvement of the Portuguese in Africa. And at the time, what was interesting is that the Africans had their own states and societies, their own civilizations with advanced cultures and governments. And the Portuguese and the Spanish had to negotiate their way into these African cultures. The Africans were pretty insistent that Europeans stay on the coast and do their trading on the coastline. So they would gather up slaves from the interior of Africa, haul them to the coast, and sell them to the Europeans there. And here are explorers reaching the New World. They've brought their cross, so they're bringing God. And they're meeting with natives, trading with the natives. So here are two motives, God and goods. The Portuguese might have been the initiators of all this movement, but it's the Spanish who really kick it into high gear. Between 1490 and 1600, the Spanish accelerate their invasion, conquest, and control over the New World, basically taking everything except for what we would today label Brazil. Brazil is Portuguese. The Pope eventually decrees a division between Spain and Portugal, and they draw the line, and so that's why Portugal gets all of this. Spain gets everything else. And Spain is pretty brutal in their conquest because they hear that these native peoples have gold and silver and riches, and they are constantly just trotting all throughout the New World looking for these wealthy resources. With their superior weapons, they're able to quickly conquer native peoples, and then they quickly figure out and adapt native labor patterns to force native peoples to work for Spain. Spain calls this the encomienda system. The Spanish verb encomendar means to entrust. And originally it was supposed to be the idea that you had the right to work the natives on the land in exchange for protecting them, converting them to Catholicism. But eventually it became a brutal and oppressive system of slavery. So brutal and so oppressive that by the 1570s it was legally abandoned, though actually not really abandoned. But legally abandoned because of the brutality against native peoples. One Spanish religious figure, Bartolomé de las Casas, in fact argues that it would be better to stop mistreating native peoples and instead rely more on African slaves. And so African slavery becomes a dominant form of labor in this part of the world. The Spanish interaction with these native peoples also triggered a number of disease epidemics. Since native peoples did not have immunity against European diseases. And so epidemics would break out wherever the Spanish were, and then someone would carry the disease, and then it spread out here, and somebody would travel and carry the disease here. The Spanish would travel, and it would carry the disease here. So you get these waves of epidemics among native peoples that are very, very devastating. The Spanish also tried to convert the natives to Catholicism because they believe very strongly in their religious traditions, and it's very important for them to incorporate native peoples into the Catholic fold. Natives are not so keen on giving up their own religious ways, and in many cases they blend Catholic traditions with European traditions. They intermarry with Europeans. But as one scholar has rightly pointed out, this is basically a polycultural society. It's multiple cultures operating simultaneously. So it's not just even a blend of cultures. It's multiple cultures. So you might be Spanish or act Spanish in one context, but in another context be completely native. The Spanish also invade North America looking for resources and riches, kidnapping native peoples along the way, as De Soto did as he traveled through South Carolina and North Carolina and all the way to the Mississippi. So did Ponce de Leon, Cabeza de Vaca, Coronado. All these guys are looking for wealth and resources, but they don't find it, so they do the next best thing and they settle, conquer in the name of Catholicism, convert native peoples, and find other ways to make money. Here is an illustration of what is known as the castas, the Spanish system of recognizing the different intermarriages between Europeans and native peoples, as well as Africans. So every mixture of people would be seen as different. So Spanish and African results in something, Spanish and Indian results in something, Spanish and half African, half Indian results in something. So they've got categories for all of these intermixtures. And this map just shows the two major powers at the time in colonization. We've got Portugal down here, Spain here. You can see Portugal all along the coast of Africa, the Portuguese Empire in Southeast Asia as well. Notice it is coastal. In many cases, the Portuguese are only interested in trade, so they land on the coast. Native peoples say, don't go any further, or we'll meet you there. Show us what you got. Here are our spices, here are our goods. Here's an illustration showing native peoples being forced to mine for precious metals at Potosi. Scholars since the 70s have labeled this intersection of the new and the old worlds the Columbian exchange, which is an exchange of goods, but also ideas, but also people, also diseases, and also food. From the old to the new, and from the new to the old. It goes in both directions. Diseases were particularly devastating to native peoples. 90% of some native peoples were killed off by these disease epidemics. European plants were brought over, sometimes accidentally, and they ended up choking out native plants. In some cases, natives adopted European plants. For example, the Cherokees came to love peaches and were very fond of them once they showed up. Other plants were annoying, like there's an English plant called dock, which has very large leaves, and so Indians called it Englishman's foot because they said it showed up everywhere an Englishman had stepped. European animals also came over and they destroyed Indian gardens, they flooded Indian woodlands, eating up the resources. trampling through the woods, driving out native species. Sometimes Indians adapted and enjoyed European, animals. So southeastern Indians, for example, became fond of hunting pigs, which were dropped off by Europeans, the Spanish in the 1540s. The Spanish also dropped off horses, and so native peoples quickly adapted to horse culture, and that showed that they were capable of being resilient in the face of this onslaught, biological onslaught. In Europe, there was a population boom for new plants, particularly corn, potatoes, tomatoes, that Europeans quickly found out were not only delicious but nutritious and could be grown in Europe and feed the starving masses of the Old World. But as much as the Spanish and the Portuguese loved the gold and silver, it did have a deleterious effect on the Spanish economy. It caused inflation, about a 1.5% a year inflation rate, charted here in this diagram showing the general rise in prices of grain, livestock, and wood over the 1450 to 1640 time period, thanks to the Spanish flooding the economy with all that gold and silver. So as that was rising, this chart shows the declining populations of Native Americans from upwards of 30 million in Mexico down to less than 2.5 million by 1593. So I'll leave you with this very sad image of a native person experiencing smallpox as a result of contact with the Europeans. In the end, the Columbian exchange was probably more harmful for native peoples, though they certainly adapted and grew used to it and rebounded and showed resilience. So there are certainly positives, simply because they, figured out how to adapt. The Europeans probably ultimately, in the long run, got the better end of the deal out of this Columbian exchange.